question on the business rationale, and I guess touching on what Anne-Maria was saying earlier. And Joe, is there a business rationale or imperative for applying sustainable finance principles? And let's go back to my introduction on the Amazon rainforest. Is there anything that we can relate to here, and we can perhaps talk even about Bolsonaro's case study of burning the Amazon rainforest last year?
Yeah, absolutely, Deepesh. To answer your first question, is there a business imperative? 100%. This is not nice to have anymore, or something that, yeah, you put in a marketing brochure, as Anna-Maria was saying. There is definitely a business imperative. And why is it? Well, simply because we have, if we look at who is important for a business, it's basically three key stakeholders, right? It's their own employees, it's consumers, obviously, and it is shareholders. And we are seeing more and more a push by today's consumers and by today's individuals, whether they then for employees or shareholders or whatever, towards a more ESG positive outcome. So we're really not just talking about green, right? We're talking about environmental, we're talking about social, and also governance. I find the discussions that are happening, for example, at the moment around Amazon might to see the first union being created actually quite interesting, because it's one of these things where, as a consumer, I think we all like to order from Amazon because it's convenient, but actually from a governance model we hear some pretty poor things about the company, and it's things like that which I think drive an interesting discussion. It's interesting what you're saying about Bolsonaro and the rainforest is certainly interesting, because ultimately Bolsonaro's burning down the rainforest is driven by an increased demand for soy products, right? And this increased demand for soy products actually is partially driven, of course, on the one hand by a growing population, but also by a growing population looking for alternative to meat products, which in a way is a positive if we look at what sort of like global farming does, for example. But yeah, in this case, actually, we then have a scenario by which actually there's significant harm being done. What I found interesting about that discussion and that debate in particular is, of course, there was a public outcry and there was a lot of criticism, but there was also a lot of criticism of the critics. So overall, I think it's fair to say that this is still a very hotly debated topic, but at the end of the day, it's also a trend which cannot be stopped. I mean, ESG is on so many people's agendas. Of course, it also depends in which part of the world you are, whether you're in the developing world or in the developed world. But at the end of the day, companies must act today in order to be ready. Like, there is no time to waste, and hence it is a business imperative, 100%.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess let's talk about assessing risk. Katerina, how can we assess risk when it comes to sustainable trade finance?
Deepesh, that's actually a very good question, because when you speak about a business case, and that is what we actually did right now when we spoke somehow a little bit about benefit, you should not forget the risk about the potential. Let's have a look on the overall estimation which are flying around in terms of opportunities, in particular for banks. And there is a need of more than 5 trillion in investment globally. There's an estimate. And, out of that, the figures was raised of more than 100 billion revenue pool globally, which are flying around for banks. Honestly, if we have a closer look on this, we have to say that part of that is actually replacing an existing revenue pool. Why that? Because simply investments will shift from the previous fossil one to the new green world. But also there's an inherent risk, which is on the business models of the company. And when we come to sustainable trade finance and risk assessment, that should be embedded in the overall risk assessment of a business model of the client and also of a bank. And therefore, of course, what we can do when we define sustainable trade, and I think that is the key question today, and we should not wait a long time until the community has agreed on an overall and comprehensive framework. I think everybody, every bank, every party, every insurer has to do its own work. That means we need to have a questionnaire, and those questionnaires, which by the way are also regulated, at least in Europe, for the disclosure directive. So you need to have a questionnaire in the bank when you speak about risk, and that is climate and sustainability. And out of that, you will have a part which is addressing trade naturally, because you have a look on supply chains. When your supply chain is firm and it's and compatible with an ESG framework in terms of environmental topics, like, for example, let's take the shipping industry, which I mentioned in the beginning. In terms of social, meaning employee rights, particularly in emerging countries, and when it comes to transparency, we automatically find a definition as well for the trade part. So just looking on the risk is where we need to start. That is actually defining what we need to find as common ground for the future.